would like to first do some thank yous. I would like to thank Joshua and Cinder, who co-sponsor this event with us. That's been going on for 2 years, our Voices of Equity series. So thank you, Joshua. I'd like to thank our pro bono ASL interpreters today for being here. And we do have closed captioning. You just go down and choose closed captioning in the More section of your choices here on Zoom. All right, and I'd like to thank Justin, who's always in the background, making things happen. Thank you for being here today. So now I'd really like to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Salome. They are an amazing human who's going to talk to us about being inclusively political. And I don't want to say too much because I want them to introduce themselves. So Salome, I'm going to pass you the mic and take it away.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Salome or Salome. I use she, her pronouns, and I am so happy to be here with you all today. I have never had to, well, I can't say never. I'm not really good at giving my own introduction, so please forgive me if I forget something. But I am a first-generation queer Angolan American. My family immigrated here to the US in the 90s. I was born in Portland, Oregon. I spent most of my childhood growing up in Portland, and I attended Willamette University, where I got my degree in political science and German. I will say that I've had a very interesting background when it comes to my work experience in my profession. My first job ever was starting at the Secretary of State's office in her elections division when I was 18. And then now I currently work for Espousal Strategies, LLC, which is a local Portland Black-owned consulting firm that does a lot of work around diversity, equity, inclusion, and retention, as well as community engagement and government relations. And my current title there is Community Engagement Manager. So I spend a lot of my time engaging with members of the public around different projects and mostly infrastructure and how we can bring equity to those projects. So it's really great to be here with you all today. So Crystal told me that I had the opportunity to speak, and I'm more of a conversation person than I am giving a speech person. So if at any point you want to ask a question, please just raise your hand or simply write it in the chat, and I will try to get to it as fast as I can. But today we're going to be talking about how inclusively political things have gotten. And what I mean by that is, as you all have probably experienced, it's getting harder and harder for people to not have an identity that isn't politicized. And I just want to give some background, some context into how we got into this moment, why we're in this moment, and what it's like moving forward. I'm going to get started with just a short little story about how I started my career. I was 18 and I went to Willamette University, and I recognized that I had only been to the Capitol building once before in my life. And I decided, well, I just want to go and check it out and walk around and see what's going on in the building. There was no session happening, so there wasn't a lot of people in there. And so I just wandered the halls looking at artwork and just trying to get a sense of this building and where things were, and maybe catch a tour if I was lucky. And as I walked around, I came upon this room in this like weird little alley. For those who have been to the Capitol building, I was on the 3rd floor in between the House and the Senate chambers, which is like this weird area. It doesn't go all the way through, and it's kind of mazy if you don't know where you're going. But I've stumbled upon this room, and I walked in, and I thought it was a visitor's lounge. And the reason why I thought it was a visitor's lounge was because there was food and drinks left there unattended with no signage, no nothing. So I decided to walk in, and after like waiting for about a minute and a half, I definitely pulled a Goldilocks and sat down and started making a plate of food. It wasn't my most shining moment ever, but definitely was hungry and a new college student or incoming college student. And so I sat down, started eating, and probably another 5 minutes later, people started trickling in, and I realized that I'd messed up. and that it wasn't just it wasn't a visitor's lounge, but more so food for a planned meeting at that. And so as I was sitting there, I'm not really certain what to do at this point because there was only one point of entry and exit. And so I would have to walk through people to get out. And at that point, that would just draw way too much attention to myself. So I just sat at my little seat and kept eating. And I got to this point where this meeting was happening and I started to panic and I started to hear my mom's voice in my head because she was like, "You've been here an hour, you haven't said anything, everyone's looking at everybody, like you got to say something." And from the conversation, I captured that they were trying to figure out new ways to engage new voters or people who aren't registered to vote and get them to register to vote. And so I came up with this harebrained idea and I said, well, how about we register people to vote at their naturalization ceremonies. My parents immigrated here, and when they got naturalized as citizens, there was like an hour wait time between when they passed the test and they knew they passed the test to when those certificates were printed and they could take pictures and whatnot. And so you have like a room full of people that you know are citizens who aren't registered. So why not just register them there? And the whole room kind of went this buzz and was really concerned. They're like, well, that's federal building space. And can we do that? We're not sure. Is anyone else doing that? And it came into this like really question. And I was like, I don't know. Why not try? And if the feds don't like it, then we stop. But like, I mean, we're not telling them how to vote. We're just asking them if they want to register to vote. And so fast forward to now, we have about over 28 states that do this program, and Oregon being the first, and our then Secretary of State, Kate Brown, is now governor. And so I think that it's just a way to show that you don't necessarily have to know all the details to still have a good idea that's worthy and something that can make huge change. And so going back to this idea of inclusively political, I just wanted to point out in that story, the big crux of it was me choosing to vocalize my lived experience. Because I had the experience of parents who immigrate to the US, I knew about naturalization ceremonies and what occurs inside of them. To whereas other people in that room, that might not have been their experience, so they may never have thought about going into those spaces. I think the other great thing about that is because of my lack of experience at the time and not knowing or feeling the pressures of how things have always been, I was able to be creative in a way that people who may have had that job for a long time, their first response was, can we actually do that? That's a federal building in a federal space. And so I just really want to highlight that is, I didn't get my first job ever by being super brilliant. I just got my first job ever by opening my mouth and saying the first thing that kind of came to mind through my own lens and experience. And so as we talk about our identities and being inclusively political, what that means is that I'm pretty certain many people in this room have identities that have been politicized, whether it's our sexual orientation, our gender, our citizen status or lack thereof, our income level. But all of these things are things that kind of force us to be political, if you will. And as you know, as time's gone on, there's less and less people who can really be apolitical, if that's even a thing of possibility anymore. And I challenge the idea of being apolitical because I really think that as we move forward in a society and we're trying to figure out how we can all coexist, we end up creating policy that make things political. And that is because policy in general is handling human lives. And there's no way to handle human lives without getting involved in what people do. So I do know that we have moved from a place where that policy has come from a place of harm to trying to do some restorative justice, trying to erase or mitigate some of that harm. And we're talking institutions and systems that have been around for hundreds of years, and we're just barely now, maybe 5, 10, 20 years at max into trying to dismantle these systems. and trying to create something different. It's a daunting task, it's a heavy task, but it is one that is necessary. And right now we see this whole buzz around everyone wanting to do equity, everyone wanting to do equity, equity this, equity that. How do we make this more equitable? How do we provide equity? And it's kind of generate this buzz, if you will, in communities to where people are now starting to look at those things and go, but is it really equitable? Is this really what we need to be doing right now? And is this something of value, or is this just another check the box kind of engagement or policy that makes some people's lives a little bit better, but isn't really tackling the root of the issue? And there is a lot of fatigue, to be honest. There's a lot of fatigue around this because as we have these conversations, they aren't pretty. It isn't really easy to be in a space where you're trying to make things better, you have respect for someone, and through a culmination of microaggressions, and not necessarily one person, but a culmination of microaggressions, a space isn't as equitable as you may have hoped it to be or want it to be. That also is very true for some of our policies, some of our ways of moving forward. And I think that as we try to think about whether or not our one action is equitable or one interaction is equitable, we should really try to put that in the context of the larger system at play that we're trying to move or push together. I say this because, again, these things took hundreds of years to get us to this point. It's not something that's going to give up the fight easily. It's definitely walking into a David and Goliath type of situation. And unfortunately, for our folks who do equity, they know this better than most. There is no one little magic rock that you can throw at this creature to just take it down. It's going to be a grueling battle, one that is not going to be solved by just one person or one method. And I think that, in that space, we should think about the political parts of this, right? We talk about how do we get from that space of how do I help this one person into how do I help these many people? And we talk about it through the use of the impact of said policy, the impact of our efforts. And even going back to my anecdote in the beginning, I had one idea, and it might have started off as an idea that would have been like, hey, this would have been great for my parents. But it turned into an idea that was great for a lot of people in a lot of different places. And that is because their experience is one that is unique to them, but has some very commonalities with some other folks. And so that commonality being they're not the only two people who have ever sat in an immigration office waiting for their citizenship documents to be printed and getting issued new identification. And so through that particular effort, you can see how something that might have seemed small and insignificant can actually be something that can cause a rippling effect. And so I also want to touch on, where do we move from here? We're in this space now where a good number of us, I can't say all of us, are trying to figure out how do we dismantle these systems? How do we dismantle all of these different forms of oppressions and isms that currently exist that at this point, we may feel like we've only been able to identify and start to scratch the surface. And for that, I think that it comes back to that idea of having enough grace to recognize that you're a piece of this and what you're trying to do is probably a small piece of this that can have rippling impacts. That can be something that may be small in the grand scheme of things, but something significant in the present sense. I want to go back and touch about the time that I had co-founding the Black Resilience Fund. Something that started off really small, which was like a small amount of money that some folks gave to be redistributed to Black folk in the Portland area, turning into something larger, which was, before I could even blink, we were like at $1.5 million in less than a year and issuing out direct cash assistance to individuals who identify as Black. And I say that that's something large, but $1 million is not that much money when you really think about it. But it is making the difference in big rippling ways in terms of what people chose to do with that money, what people chose to invest it in, pay off. And in some cases, it even turned into how people gain skill sets, because a lot of those folks who received that cash assistance turned around and wanted to volunteer. And so now I had a whole fleet of 45 different, mostly Black women and queer folk who were learning how to use Zoom for the first time so they could conduct interviews. And now they had a new skill they could put on their resume. And that just being such a big critical part of going through the pandemic made them very appealing to jobs they were applying for. And Crystal, I see your hand up.
Yeah, we had a question come through.
Sweet.
Does the government ever go outside of their constituents and or base to ask for their feedback on any given policy? I think they do, but how do we as taxpayers know where to find information on if they have an open call for review and or a comment on policies?
So one of my biggest strategies whenever I'm trying to engage specifically with a government body or with an elected official in particular, as cliche as it sounds, I try to find places where they're at. So most of the time they'll have a calendar of some sorts that's up. I will look for what's an event that they have going on that I can go to potentially meet someone in their staff. Not necessarily meet them, but bump into their staff. I say this because, a lot of people kind of bum rush the elected official or the folks that are in the front of the room. They're not really looking for who are the staff people that are off to the sides, who are the Joshuas, who are the others that are managing things from the sidelines and from the back of the room that actually have the time to engage with me and talk to me about what I want to talk about. I'd also say that they do, in terms of having public comment and such, there's usually meetings that allow for public comment. There's always the ability to email, to write, to phone call. It's just a matter of finding it on the site that they have. But I would also say that there are points in which a lot of these projects and a lot of these elected officials are all trying to say, and I'm pretty sure you've heard it before, doing things differently and wanting to be more open and engaging. But I think one of the things that they are having a hard time with is finding folks that they haven't always engaged with. Because when you use certain engagement tools, you end up getting the same type of people over and over again, because you're not going into new spaces. You're not trying new ways to engage. And so I would say that sometimes they may be trying to look for you, but they just don't know where to find you. And other times it's just takes you yelling at where you're at or finding where they're at. And I don't want to say confronting, but going up to them and being like, hey, I'm here. And this is the type of person you should be talking to and why I'm the type of person you should be talking to. Because at the end of the day, they are the ones who are claiming or trying to be more equitable. And so you have the thing to offer to them, which is your lived experience, your presence, your perspective on things that they haven't heard before.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So I'm glad that question came in because I was about to pause for questions anyway. So if anyone else has any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Yeah, if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand and we can take you off mute, or you can put it in the chat and I'm happy to ask it for you, or you can send it to me directly if you want something anonymized. But yeah. Quiet room today. Go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, I guess without giving away free labor, because I do this for a living, I would say that also when it comes to advocating for your voice, one of the things that I find really helpful is an exercise that a lot of folks who are considering running for office do, which is trying to figure out a way to tell your story. Figuring out what are your key points, what are your things you have to offer, what is your background, what is your lived experience, and really figuring that out. Because once you know your story, once you have a sense and you like what your story is, how to introduce yourself, how to talk about what you have to offer, the better off you are. It is so helpful to have people who are just aware of their identities, aware of what they have to offer. Because at the end of the day, even if you think like, oh, I don't really know anybody important, I don't really know much in terms of the policy, you still are a part of different communities that people pay so much money to try to engage with. Speaking to which, just those relationships being so valuable. Like, I can't even tell you that even if I didn't have the job I had and have the background I have, I still am a person who has access to probably over 400 people who identify as immigrant or refugee. And that's something that projects would kill to have as a part of their staff or as a focal point to reach out to. And just even being a member of a community can be something so powerful if you are, one, aware of the community that you belong to, and you're willing to make connections within said community.
Yeah, I think that's really true, right? Connection is so important. And I would think, not being in politics, but I would think that the more people I know, the more people they would know if I'm someone who's a part of that, sort of like the ripple effect that you're talking about. I'm connected to 500 people, and those 500 people could be voters or the people that they want to support them, right? Do any of the government officials, do they get equity and inclusion training or any of that type of stuff to help them learn how to interact? Or I don't know. I feel like there's, I don't know. That's a silly question, but.
No, it's definitely not a silly question. So it's kind of interesting because it made me giggle because when I started working for the Secretary of State's office when I was 18, and when I worked then for the Senate Majority Office when I was 19, it was very interesting because they had like this anti-harassment training that was mandatory that everyone had to take, including elected officials and lobbyists. And so it was a very basic, in my opinion, how not to grab people inappropriately type of training.
Right.
And what language to use and not to use to make people feel comfortable or discomfortable in the space. I think, though, there are elected officials that I know of that reach out to consulting firms to get further training for them and their staff. And that's something that's based off of the elected's own personal commitment to it. We do have this kind of issue in Oregon right now around harassment in the workplace when it comes to the legislature. And I know that the legislature is dealing really heavily with that and trying to figure out how to mend that, because they do recognize that there hasn't been a really great process for staffers of elected officials to make harassment complaints, especially in regards to when it comes to elected officials themselves or lobbyists. And so I do know that that is something that they're working on, but something that they've been struggling with for a while. And yeah, it goes back to a legislator's own, and this also extends to the city of Portland. They have anti-harassment trainings, and so does the county. But if a elected official, there's nothing stopping them from seeking more for their office and for themselves if they wanted more.
Okay. Does that mean, like, I guess I'm just thinking from a corporate standpoint? Maybe are there ERGs in the legislature and that sort of thing, like support for different types of folks working in the legislature?
The legislature has really grown since the last time I worked there. There's a lot more affinity groups that come together in the legislature, such as like the BIPOC caucus for the elected officials of color. There's a sort of BIPOC staffers group, a queer staffers group, and they are forming their own sort of support systems, if that makes sense. And it's really interesting because these are sensitive topics that I think even in corporate world, it's how do you do that without someone else feeling left out or feeling the type of way or wanting to sue the company because the company doesn't have this particular thing. And so I think that that's not something that's missed upon when it comes to some of these government agencies, is like, how do we let there be space for this? But how do we make sure that we're also keeping at least things sound as we can, and keep things going?
Yeah, I think that is, I think that's a struggle for a lot of companies outside of the government as well, as how do we create this brave, safe space for folks to keep having conversations and to keep having space for people to go so they can have these conversations, right? So
exactly. And sometimes they get it for free when they are working on a project, let's say, and they just happen to have a DEI consulting firm that's there helping them with the outward facing stuff that ends up helping them with the inward facing stuff, and helping other staff on the project, I shouldn't say get along better, but be more equitable in their approach.
Awesome. Well, there's one more question I want to ask. Really, besides voting and networking, what would you like to see the community do? More of what? What can the community do to help facilitate the change that we want in our government and our systems?
Yeah, I would say you can't emphasize connections enough, because you never really know who you know until you go out there and start chatting people up. I also say that in the sense of there's a lot of people with a lot of great ideas, and just knowing people can make you be someone super resourceful to be like, oh, you want to do this? Well, I know a person who does something similar like this, and maybe they know somebody who does something that you want to do, or something similar to what you want to do and can help you out. There's also just the sheer being willing to meet new people and make new connections and helping each other find resources. I know that as individuals in the community, we're really good at being resourceful. We're really good at being tenacious, especially those from equity priority communities. But I also say that what we need to do better at is building a bridge between us being resourceful and our relationships with others. Being willing to be like, well, I know this person has a really great idea, and if I'm in my way in life, I meet somebody new who works in that industry or works in that field, passing that idea along and connecting those two people, because it could end up being something amazing. I mean that in the sense that when even starting the Black Resilience Fund, Cameron Whitten was calling a bunch of people, but at the same time was expressing the need to have like, well, I need somebody who can really help me with this, who maybe has a background in systems and organizations and knows a lot of people. And then it was through us connecting, because before that we kind of saw each other in passing, but didn't really have a relationship to speak of. And through that experience, I was able to bring in my resources and my skill set to expand this idea into something a lot larger than either of us could imagine.
Yeah, I think that connection is so important, and helping each other, right? We are at time, and I could probably talk about this all day, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time. It's 9:30. I know we have meetings that we might be trying to get to, but I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your story and your insights today. I think this is a vital conversation, and I think we all are able to do our part by helping out in the community, and voting, and really putting effort into that and being intentional. So thank you for being here today. And thank you everyone who joined us. I appreciate you being here, and I hope to see you at our next Voices of Equity event. And have a beautiful Friday, everyone.